This episode is brought to you by DeSanto Propane. DeSanto has been serving the energy needs of upstate New York since 1937. They're a fourth-generation family-owned business that has prioritized dependability, reliability, and integrity. If you have energy needs, call DeSanto and tell them we sent you. Visit DeSantoPropane.com to learn more. And by the Fox family of dealerships on Route 5 in Auburn. Check out their vast inventory of new and used cars by visiting foxdealerships.com. From FingerLakes1.com, this is Inside the FLX. I'm Josh Gerso, and this hour we have Andy Zepp in studio. He is the Executive Director of the Finger Lakes Land Trust. Andy, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
So let's start out with the easy one. What is the Land Trust, and how did it form?
We're a nonprofit organization that was established 30 years ago, and our goal is to work with landowners and local communities to come up with the win-win solutions that conserve those lands that really define the character of the region.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of, when we talk about conserving land, what kinds of properties and lands are you actually talking about? What are some of the different types?
Right now, we're particularly focused on those lands that are important for water quality. There's a lot of concern over toxic algae outbreaks, and the health of the lakes depends on the health of the land. Mm-hmm. So while that's a focus, though, we also work to protect natural areas, our rugged gorges, scenic farmland, and also recreational trails that we're seeing a growing network through the region that's great for residents and visitors alike.
And you mentioned that obviously tourism is hugely reliant on the natural resources that we have around here. How do you start that conversation with folks who may not necessarily understand right off the bat just how important it is to work in conservation and to make sure that we are preserving these awesome resources around us?
It's really changed over the years because I've worked in conservation in the Finger Lakes for several decades now. And that is something where I think whether you're a town board member, a merchant, a farmer, people understand that between our agricultural economy and our tourism economy and these beautiful lakes, that we have to take care of the land for, if nothing else, our economic future.
Mm-hmm. And as far as the work that you guys do, it appears as though there's some accreditation involved in the processes that you guys have established. Talk to us a little bit about sort of the back end of how the organization works itself.
Yeah, the Land Trust works with individual landowners. In some cases, we might actually acquire the land and make it available to the public. But a lot of other cases, we're using a tool called a conservation easement that limits development while allowing for traditional uses such as agriculture and forestry, and then we form a partnership for the future. But all of these projects are only of value if they can stand the test of time. So we're accredited by a national organization that works with land trusts across the entire country to ensure that when we're all gone, and even our kids are all gone, that our organization will be taking care of these lands, which now spans 24,000 acres and is increasing every year.
It's wild. You guys really do have a huge stake in the region. Public access, you mentioned that, to some of these natural resources around the region. When you look at sort of not just the conservation side, but how important the tourism and all of that is to the Finger Lakes, how important is ensuring that there is public access to the various resources that we have around the region?
Well, I'm struck by seeing local residents who are told by their doctor to get out and walk. Yeah. And you'll see it, especially in December, on the side of a dark road, someone walking along in pretty sketchy conditions. Yeah. And I'm a runner and a walker, and I just see tremendous value in these. We've worked with the Cayuga Seneca Trail, where we've helped enhance access to what is a very popular recreational resource. And in some cases, it's protecting existing resources. So, for example, the Finger Lakes hiking trail spans the whole region, is quite popular, but about 30 to 40% of that trail is based on a handshake agreement. Mm-hmm. And some of these aren't standing the test of time, particularly in an area near Ithaca, where the 100-acre farm becomes 10 10-acre lots. So we're working with the Finger Lakes Trail Conference and local municipalities to secure a route so as the area grows and changes, we retain that resource.
And what does that process look like? When the land trust sees a piece of land or an area that they may be interested in working to help conserve, what does the process look like, from an X's and O's standpoint of how you guys go through that?
A lot of what we do is simply to provide options for landowners. And we recognize that it may not make sense for a particular owner at a certain time. So we present information. We don't try to sell it. We just try to provide these options. And then we keep at it because we're talking about sensitive issues, sometimes of family finance, adult children in the decision-making who may not live in the state. Mm-hmm. So then we try to maintain and build trust in a relationship that may span decades. Mm-hmm. But we want to be there when that family is deciding, well, we're going to move to Charlotte, North Carolina and sell the place, or we're going to pass it down. And there could be some tax advantages, or there could be actually a sale for conservation that makes sense to that family.
Mm-hmm. And when you sort of look back at your time with the land trust, what are some of the examples that stick out to you as just super beneficial, not just to those involved directly, but then the community at large and sort of the conservation community as well at the same time?
Yeah, there are two very different projects come to mind. One is down near Ithaca between Buttermilk Falls and Robert Treeman State Parks. The Finger Lakes Trail passes through a beautiful gorge called Lick Brook. And this was one of the inspirations for starting the Land Trust 30 years ago. This was a site less than a mile or 2 miles from downtown Ithaca, at the time all privately owned, in an area that's starting to develop. Mm-hmm. And in that case, over 30 years, we've been able to secure this beautiful, very popular resource through all the tools in the toolbox. One property was acquired through purchase. An adjacent property still remains private but is protected by an easement. And a third parcel was acquired by New York State Parks with assistance from the Land Trust. So there was a case of creating a publicly accessible resource that in perpetuity everyone will be able to go and enjoy. On the other hand, a favorite local farm of mine between Aurora and Union Springs is Great Gully Farm. It's a stunning farm with thousands of feet of lakefront, meticulous fields, quite scenic on the Cayuga Lake Scenic Byway, and work with that family over the years to secure that farm through a conservation easement. So that remains private property. It's not open to the public, but every time I drive that road and look out over bald eagles soaring over the fields and these beautiful lake views, I think of the family legacy and how important it was to them in securing this with what's also a community resource.
And when you look at the way tourism has grown, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years in the region, how has that sort of changed the way you guys approach conservation and approach some of these different properties that, don't just have that local appeal, but literally have a region-wide appeal?
Well, we recognize that we won't be successful if we don't take the economy into account. Mm-hmm. And the two big drivers of our economy are agriculture and tourism. And on the agricultural side, we're working in places like Canandaigua to secure some of the richest farmland in New York State that we want to make sure is still available 50 years from now and is not all taken up with housing. The irony of our region is we have a tremendous amount of land relative to population, but the market will tend to drive it towards those fragile sites or the best farmland. So that's on the farmland side. On the tourism side, we see growing interest in outdoor recreation and just see making that available, creating resources such as trails, but also interpreting them. One thing we've done is launch an entirely new website and social media called gofingerlakes.org, which is simply an effort to provide good information, maps, directions, video, and so on. So if you have a guest for the weekend, what are the top 60 places to go in the Finger Lakes for hiking, cross-country skiing, canoeing, and so on? So that's part of our educational efforts to connect people with the land.
And it's interesting because we talked a little bit about that before we started here. That is probably one of the most important ventures that could be undertaken is sort of making it a little easier for someone who isn't from around here to consume and understand what all of the options are. What has been the reception been like so far since you guys launched that?
It's been terrific, and by design, we worked with the county tourism promotion agencies who are on the front line of this to make sure it served their purposes. And we see more and more people visiting the site, and it's been, I think, a valuable resource that we intend to grow in the future.
And obviously, you mentioned it off the top. Obviously, HABs, harmful algal blooms, a big concern, I guess, for everyone in the region for a whole host of reasons. From the land trust perspective, what are you guys seeing that either makes you feel good or maybe a little bit concerned about where the region is heading in the HAB fight generally?
Well, I think everyone is concerned because what we're seeing seems to be the perfect storm in a way. And while researchers are still determining the exact causes and nuance from lake to lake, because we have 11 lakes and there are some common issues, but there are also some differences, what seems to be a consensus is that on one hand, climate change is bringing us more intense rain events more frequently, so it's carrying more nutrients to the lake. At the same time, in August, September, we're getting a little warmer weather, so it's heating up those nutrients. And the cyanobacteria or toxic algae needs warm, still water and also phosphorus. And one of the issues we see is that we live in a wet climate. Come April, everything's soggy. So understandably, for about 180 years, priority one of any homeowner, farm owner, or highway supervisor is to move the water off the land and get it in the lakes. Well, we've gotten pretty good at this between all these drainage systems. The problem is that's the perfect system for getting as much phosphorus in the lake as possible. So for our part of it, we're prioritizing putting more emphasis on those lands that are, particularly our public conservation partners have identified, are vital for water quality, but also looking at how can we replumb the Finger Lakes so that our roads don't flood and we can still farm it, but that we hold back more of that stormwater so the phosphorus settles out on the land and not in the lake. And that's a huge challenge because if you drive anywhere, you see a system of ag drainage systems for agriculture as well as road ditches that have been in place and evolving for generations. So this won't be quick. And the other wild card is it does also seem that non-native freshwater mussels, particularly the quagga mussel, may be playing a role in altering the nutrient cycle to the advantage of the cyanobacteria. So it's it's going to take a long-term effort, but we know that caring for the land is a big part of it.
And does it sort of position the land trust as kind of this ideal broker to sort of sit in the middle of these different agencies and different organizations that are all trying to fight the fight and help facilitate this conversation?
I think so, because for the last 30 years, we've been not telling landowners what to do, but just providing options and building, I think, some level of credibility that we don't have for example, the engineering expertise in-house to design what needs to be done. Mm-hmm. But we're asking questions, we're educating ourselves, and we're also recognizing that we don't know all the answers, but we're seeking them, and we're respecting landowners' property rights.
Now, outside of the harmful algal bloom concerns in the region, what are some of the environmental threats, I guess, that you see as things to keep an eye on for some of those who might just be wondering where to sort of start that energy if they are curious in conservation?
There are two big issues we focus on are non-native invasive species. That in some cases, these were intentionally introduced and people were unaware of how they'd turn out. In other cases, with global trade, things like the emerald ash borer, a threat to our ash trees, probably came in on a shipping pallet. Mm-hmm. But this is radically changing our native forests. And there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, both at the local level by land trusts, but also funding research at places like Cornell to figure out long-term solutions. So that is a very big issue. Some parts of the region, not all, deer overpopulation. We have areas of forests that are not regenerating as they should. There are just too many deer. And that's a slow process that sneaks up on you because it might seem like a very attractive open forest, but if you don't see knee-high or waist-high saplings, you have to think about what about the next time that forest is harvested, or there's a windstorm and it blows over, and that next generation, we have to make sure that that next generation of trees is there.
Interesting. When you look at sort of the organization as a whole and the land trust, what are maybe some of the bigger misconceptions about what you guys do or sort of work on a daily basis?
Well, we do a wide variety of projects, so it's understandable that it's confusing.
Yeah.
But I think frequently people think we're just about nature preserves because that gets a lot of attention. You can go visit them, and that we're in this nature preserve business. And in fact, we hold more conservation easements on private property than we do have nature preserves. And these lands are not open to the public. They provide for agriculture and forestry. And that's kind of interest to a lot of families that want to keep the land in the family. But it's confusing because the word easement, people think of a driveway or a power line, so they think access. So we have a lot of education to do.
Mm-hmm. And how do you guys approach that? Big region, like we talked about earlier, a lot of miles in between communities. How do you go about getting into all of those communities? Volunteers, staff, kind of a mixed bag of both, or
a combination. We do a lot of public speaking, so we get out addressing particular audiences such as the farm community, but also just public meetings all over the region. At the same time, too, to educate folks not just about the land trust, but the resources we have, we also offer a full series of naturalist-led field trips that are throughout the region and are made available at no cost to the public. And then we're building up to our social media and web presence as another way to get the word out.
Mm-hmm. So let's look ahead, 2020. What are some of the things that the Land Trust has cooking maybe in the background that folks might not have seen yet, but might see more of in 2020 as we move forward?
Well, the biggest challenge for us collectively is conserving our last undeveloped shoreline on the lakes. There's very little left. It's very valuable, so it's a challenge to acquire these lands. Mm-hmm. But we've had some recent success, so we're very excited about conservation projects that we're working on with partners that will secure shoreline on Skinny Atlas Lake, Owasco Lake, Cayuga Lake, and Otisco. So that is not only conserving land that's important for water quality, but a number of these projects will provide public access to the shoreline, which in many areas is scarce in the Finger Lakes. Mm-hmm. So we're very excited about those projects moving forward. And in a very different vein, in the town of Canandaigua, where in the northern part of that town, you're really seeing a lot of suburban growth where people are commuting to Rochester. We're working on our fourth farmland protection project with the town and the state of New York that will secure, again, some of the best farmland we've got. Mm-hmm. And also the funds provided through these programs also go into the local economy, so very meaningful.
How do you strike that balance? Because I can imagine, especially when you mentioned the northern part of Canandaigua, and I'm thinking the 332 corridor heading into Farmington and Victor, really a community that's exploding in growth. How do you have that conversation where it doesn't feel like you're trying to clamp down on what people see from the outside as good economic development, housing development, things that people want to see more of, while sort of bringing the conversation back to the really important work that is conservation?
Well, in that case, it's quite simple. We're following the town's lead, and in particular, its comprehensive plan, mm-hmm. where in a town like Canandaigua, there's ample room to do both. There's plenty of room to have housing, but it takes being active and proactive. So as we look at where to work, we start from public plans, whether that's New York State's open space plan, whether it's a county comprehensive plan or town plans. So we understand that to be successful, we need partners and we need to serve the community. So it's not just about what the land trust thinks, it's about what the community wants.
So let's talk a little bit of policy if we can. What are some of the things that you guys are watching either at the state level or the federal level as things to simply pay attention to and maybe have your eye for one reason or another?
Well, we're always looking. The land trust is supported primarily by private contributions. Right. We have about 2,800 members who support our work. But there are projects such as these farmland protection projects that we receive public funding. Mm-hmm. And of course, the interest in those programs far exceeds the supply of dollars. Yeah. So we're very interested to secure additional resources because in a place like Route 332 in Canandaigua, it's now or it's not going to happen. Yeah. So we have a window of opportunity, particularly in areas like that and the last undeveloped shoreline. So we're very interested in seeing additional funding. And also we're hopeful for a new program for forests where we now have a competitive program statewide to seek farmland protection funds, but we don't have a similar program for the owners of forests, particularly in the southern tier. And we're hopeful about creating a program like that. So currently we can go to a forest owner and say, would you consider an easement donation? Here are some tax incentives. But what we'd really be hopeful for is some funds to acquire those lands and look for sites in some cases that complement existing public lands where you might be standing in a state park but actually looking at private property. So to secure key parcels like that.
Mm-hmm. So how can folks get involved with what you guys are doing? Sort of boots on the ground. What are some of the things and some of the ways they can contribute to the land trust effort?
Well, we couldn't exist without a robust volunteer program. And at any given time, we have more than 200 active volunteers. So by going to the Land Trust website, fllt.org, it's very easy to sign up as a member or just as a volunteer for a day or on an ongoing basis. For example, we have 35 conservation areas and trails that are open to the public. And the way those are maintained in many cases is by volunteers who help go out and keep those areas open. As we get into water quality more, we're doing a lot more tree planting and restoring buffers to streams, and that's something we do with volunteers as well.
And when you look at sort of what you guys are able to accomplish in the digital space, in creating some awareness and in doing some of that work, how much of a valuable asset is that when you're looking at the fact that you are a more lean organization and there aren't an endless supply of employees and an endless supply of funding? How does that digital side of things sort of help you guys be able to get the message out?
Well, it's essential because the Finger Lakes the region spans 12 counties, an area about the size of Vermont. While we do have extensive volunteer network and we have a dedicated staff, it is a lot of ground to cover. And we also work on a variety of different projects from water quality to farmland. So communicating that and sharing information through our websites is critical. In fact, just to try to be useful to help the public, we expanded our website with water quality resources to address the toxic algae issue. We also communicate with a lot of expats of the Finger Lakes, folks who have moved away but want to stay connected and want to return, officials in Albany. So the digital space is very important, both through websites and e-news and social media.
Mm-hmm. What is the single most reassuring fact that you can bring to folks, or that you do bring to folks, about the state of conservation in the Finger Lakes right now and the direction it's headed?
I think for me, because I've been at it a while, is the examples of how resilient nature can be. So we're in a very challenging time between toxic algae, climate change, invasives. But I actually started out in conservation when there was one bald eagle nest in the whole state on Hemlock Lake. It was the only one. DDT had hit these birds, and that one pair was infertile at the time. And the state, the State Wildlife Bureau restored that population, where now there are hundreds of pairs, and on every Finger Lake, you can see those birds reliably. So we've created some of these problems, but if we have the will, we have the ability to reverse them.
Really appreciate the time, Andy. Thanks a lot for coming in. Best of luck with everything the rest of this year.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us this hour on Inside the FLX. I'm Josh Durso, and we'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, download the FingerLakes1.com app to have the latest local breaking news, alerts, and podcasts delivered right to your hand each and every day. Follow and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you enjoy the program and can support us, head over to patreon.com/FL1 to pledge monthly support. If you have an idea for a show or simply want to let your voice be heard, drop us an email or leave us a voice message by visiting InsideTheFLX.com. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you back here next week.